This event is one that's been made possible by a few people I feel duty bound to acknowledge, but I'm also delighted to do that. I want to acknowledge Arnold Saltzman above all, simply because it's his institute that in sponsoring this lecture has really provided us with the wherewithal to make it all work. But then alongside him, I want to also acknowledge, in spirit at least, alongside him, Roger Hertog. Hertog Foundation. It was the Hertog Foundation that created the Hertog Global Strategy Initiative. And this lecture is the first in a series that will take place under those auspices. Let me just say something briefly about what this is all about. The Hertog Global Strategy Initiative is meant to create a kind of laboratory for historical research that can help us think about new approaches to some of the most pressing problems in world politics. In a way, it's what happens when you blow the walls down in a university and try to build something completely new in order to find out, who are the people, what's the skill set we need to bring together for a summer to work on these problems. This year, the problem is going to be the history and perhaps the future of nuclear proliferation. Next summer, we're looking at the history of public health, preparations for the next pandemic. But this program, it's in itself a little bit like a nuclear bomb in that it has different components. It's not just that we blow the walls down. It's also got different pieces to it. This lecture series is at the very core of this initiative. But there's also been a workshop. We're coming fresh from that workshop where Hans Blix spent the whole day advising our students in how to orient their research. He was joined there by a lot of the leading experts in history. There are also classes. Anders Stephenson is teaching a course this summer on the Cold War. We have a seminar that runs alongside this lecture series for those of you interested in in-depth discussions about the work of the speakers. It will take place every Thursday between 4 and 6. And I could say other things about it, but I just invite you to have a look at our website, which says much more. Hans Blix, is a man, who, as we all know, made history, and I think that's one reason why he cares so much about how we study it. He can bear witness to the tragic consequences when international law fails to reflect the world as it is, or suffice in itself to change that world. So he's therefore the perfect person, I think, to inaugurate the Hertog Lectures in Global Strategy. Jean-Marie Guénaud, I think probably would rather I say very little about him to leave him more time to speak about his old conflict. But I have to say that Jean-Marie, I think, shares my goal in wanting to make Columbia a center, perhaps the center, for the study of the history and future of global governance. I think it would make sense that Columbia be the place where we can begin to write that history and maybe even change it. So, he comes also as somebody who made history. He was the director of policy planning in the French Foreign Ministry. From there, he went on to many high-level positions in the United Nations. Most recently, he was the Undersecretary General for Peacekeeping Operations during a period that witnessed the largest expansion in the deployment of UN peacekeepers all over the world. There are now 100,000 forces in 100,000 troops in the field now wearing those blue helmets. And he's also, of course, the Saltzman Professor of Professional Practice in International and Public Affairs. So with no further ado, let me turn things over to Jean-Marie, and thank you again for coming.
Thank you, Matt. It's a great honor and a great pleasure to introduce Hans Blix. And I must say that we at the Arnold Saltzman Institute of War and Peace Studies, we're very pleased that this event can take place, and I want to acknowledge the presence of Arnold Saltzman with us today. Thank you, sir. Hans Blix, you know his biography. After being the Foreign Minister of Sweden, it will soon be 30 years that you've been working on nuclear matters and on fighting the spread of nuclear weapons and working for nuclear disarmament. You started as the director of the International Atomic Energy Agency, I would say transforming that agency in many ways, making it a body that now all the world looks at for serious and credible verification and many other activities. And then you are very well known, and Matt referred to that, for what you did as the chairman of the executive chairman of UNMOVIC. And you didn't stop there, because when you left the United Nations, you chaired the Commission on Weapons of Mass Destruction to work on real full so that the world would be would get rid of nuclear weapons and all weapons of mass destruction. So there is no better expert to discuss the topics at hand today, but for me, I must say that's not what matters most. What matters is what I remember as a UN civil servant in the run-up to the Iraq War. I remember meeting you several times at the end of very long days when the building was almost deserted, and you were still there doing an impossible task, and you were the honor of what an international civil servant represents. And I cannot but think of your illustrious compatriot Daga Marshall, who said with, I don't know, a mix of Swedish dry humor and understatement, I read in the biography of Brian Urquhart that he once said, yes, the UN, yes, they are the servants of member states, but a servant should at the right moment tell his master a little bit about what he thinks about the right development. And I think you told more than a little bit. Because your loyalty, and again I'm quoting Daga Marshall, was to the UN. Daga Marshall said there should be only one loyalty, and that is the one to the United Nations. So in those very difficult moments when the concept of an international organization and an international civil servant was really at stake, you gave us all hope. And I would end on one last quote of Daga Marshall, who said if the international civil service was to fail, that would be the Munich of international cooperation. He said that, I think, 10 days before his death in a speech to UN staff. Well, thanks to you, we know that that did not happen. And you are an inspiration for all those who believe that serving an international organization is in a way ahead of it, still very much ahead of its time. And your work has had a lot of meaning because of that, and you're very engaged today in issues that are discussed as we speak at the United Nations, as when the NPT review conference comes to an end, that are discussed at the United Nations as the Security Council considers what to do about Iran, about Korea, North Korea. You are going to talk about those issues with the calm, with the moderation, the integrity that earned you so much respect. So thank you for being here today.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much, Matt, and thank you very much, Jean-Marie, for those kind introductory words, reminding you that my function at the UN, otherwise I'm mostly known in the world for my participation or appearance in Team America, as you all know. I'm very pleased to be invited to Columbia University to talk about nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation. This is, as in other areas, critical thinking is vitally important when discussing nuclear disarmament. and universities are the right places for critical thinking. I remember the saying that I admire those who search for the truth, and I'm a little worried about those who have the truth. I had the great privilege to be a student at Columbia University in the law school in 1954 to 1956, and I'm a grateful pupil of distinguished professors like Philip Jessup and Oliver Lisitzin, Leland Goodrich, Wolfgang Friedman, and my friend Dick Gardner. I remember them with warmth and with admiration. As a student, I learned about the prohibition of use of particularly horrible weapons like the dum-dum bullet. It is in the tradition of these rules that we now discuss bans that aim at the reduction and eventual elimination of nuclear weapons. No weapons, no use. I also learned about the other approach to avoid the use of weapons, all weapons, namely the legal limitations on the use of force. No war, no use of weapons. In this regard, we should note that the Charter of the UN has outlawed the threat or use of force between states and made exceptions only for two cases: the self-defense against armed attacks and armed force authorized by the Security Council. These restrictions on the use of armed force stood at the center of the legal objections to the war that was waged in Iraq, ostensibly to eliminate weapons of mass destruction. These provisions mark a momentous development in the international community, the more so as their enforcement was backed by the creation of the Security Council with broad power to intervene, if need be, even by military power. Admittedly, the Charter restrictions on the use of force have often been violated, and the Security Council has been paralyzed during much of its life. On the other hand, the security system has been complemented by peacekeeping operations and the newer practice of peace building. And I'm happy to acknowledge that in the presence of Jean-Marie Guéhenno, who so successfully headed the peacekeeping and built it up for many years. And Hammarskjöld began it originally with the Suez affair. We should note that the number of interstate wars in the world seems to be going down. The accelerating interdependence of states creates impediments to a resort to weapons and incentives to accommodation and to the use of common institutions. This larger picture should be kept in mind when we discuss nuclear non-proliferation and disarmament. The drive against nuclear weapons should not be a solitary action, but rather form, in my view, a central part of efforts to move towards a world that is gentler and with better organization for security for all. We should also not forget that reduction in conventional weapons, desirable in itself, sometimes have a direct importance for nuclear arms control, and that the small caliber weapons are today the real weapons of mass destruction. These are the ones that crave the greatest number of lives at the present time. The title of my presentation is Movement Toward a Nuclear Weapon-Free World. It is intentional. I do agree that the complete elimination of nuclear weapons, the global zero, is a desirable goal, and that it may indeed be wise to put it in focus to gain broad public support. I do not think that it is hopelessly naive, as some people say. Between 1910 and 1950, there were 2 world wars and 1 collapsed world organization. Much can happen between 2010 and 2050. A friend of mine said that a world without nuclear weapons will not be simply like the world we have today, minus nuclear weapons. Nevertheless, I shall limit my discussion largely to what we can do in the short and medium term, rather than looking far into the future. During the Cold War, the arsenals of nuclear warheads increased to a staggering 50,000 plus, and most measures to reduce the threats were fragmentary, such as agreements on the stopping of atmospheric tests, which had a beneficial environmental effect, or rather avoiding the further fallout of nuclear material. And the second area of fragmentary reforms were bans on the stationing of nuclear weapons in various environments, such as the seabed and outer space. By contrast to these fragmentary weapons, the Non-Proliferation Treaty that entered into force in 1970 may be read as aiming at the elimination of all nuclear weapons. The nuclear weapon states would commit themselves to stay away from non-nuclear weapon states to stay away from nuclear weapons, and the 5 nuclear weapon states would commit themselves to do away with their nuclear weapons by negotiating towards nuclear disarmament and agreements on nuclear disarmament. And lastly, the transfer of nuclear material and technologies would be facilitated between the parties to the NPT. If all states had adhered to the treaty, and if all states had fulfilled their commitments, the world would have been freed of nuclear weapons. The treaty has evidently failed to achieve this aim. Nevertheless, we can note that nearly all states have adhered, which was by no means given when the treaty was concluded. Further, that the number of states with nuclear weapons has increased by only 4 since 1970. That the number of nuclear weapons has gone down from over 50,000 plus to something like 20,000 plus. And that indeed the international market and technical assistance has effectively facilitated the access to the peaceful uses of nuclear energy. Why has the number of nuclear weapon states gone up but increased only by 4? It's due to a number of circumstances, and I shall not list them all. But I'd like to mention that it's been suggested that the bipolarity of the world during the Cold War somehow helped to hinder proliferation, and that the world is now facing the risk of cascades of states and perhaps terrorists developing nuclear weapons. I do not share this alarmist view. Most states refrain from acquiring nuclear weapons simply because they do not perceive a security need for them. While cascades are improbable, we do have reason to be worried that security concerns could raise the risk of domino effects in the Middle East, and they would be rather slow there, considering who could develop nuclear weapons in addition to Iran and Israel. And secondly, domino effects could occur in the Far East, if North Korea were to continue and give rise to pressures in South Korea and Japan. So here are 2 areas of risk of domino effects of the Iran and North Korea. Now, if perceived security concerns is the dominant incentive to acquire nuclear weapons, active efforts to reduce or eliminate such concerns should logically be the first line of non-proliferation policy. And this was indeed the view of the 2003 European Union strategy against proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. And I quote them. They said that the best solution to the problem of proliferation of weapons of mass destruction is that countries should no longer feel the need for them. If possible, political solutions should be found to the problems which lead them to seek weapons of mass destruction. The more secure countries feel, the more likely they are to abandon programs. The European recipe is easy to support, but sometimes difficult to use and to apply. Where a government appears to feel a security need for a nuclear weapon, we must ask if its security concern cannot be met by other means. We also need barriers to make the acquisition of or development of nuclear weapons more difficult to anyone tempted to try, nevertheless. Export restrictions are meant to be one such barrier against those who might be tempted to go for nuclear weapons. And the Security Council Resolution 1540 obliges all UN member states to enact such restrictions, which is a novelty, almost a sort of embarking upon a legislative function of the Security Council, which was always thought of as being an institution that intervenes ad hoc when they see a threat to the peace. Here they are urging or demanding of member states that they should enact legislation for an indefinite number of cases. The Nuclear Suppliers Group evidently also seeks to rally support export-capable countries to follow similar lines of action to avoid helping any proliferation. The enforcement of export bans through interception of transports is sought under the Proliferation Security Initiative and the UN Security Council resolutions. Now, it is hard to assess just how important these approaches have been to impede proliferation. They certainly have, that the intention behind them has been to achieve this. Economic sanctions are used to discourage proliferation. They have a mixed record. In the case of Libya, it seems that years of sanction did help to create an effective pressure, and sanctions may have given some incentives to North Korea and Iran to comply with the UN Security Council. Yet, these incentives have evidently been so far not led to any result. There could even be some questions whether they inspire defiance. Safeguards verification is designed to stop, not designed to stop proliferation, but is more than just a confidence-building measure. The risk of detection through safeguards is intended to deter from diversion of nuclear material and other violations. Inspectors are not police dogs, but they are watchdogs. They bark, but they don't bite. Nevertheless, like watchdogs, they alert masters to take action. Now let me talk about non-peaceful means of preventing proliferation for a moment. Acts of sabotage to block the development of nuclear weapons were undertaken even before the first nuclear bomb was tested. In a daring raid on a plant for the production of heavy water, the plant was blown up in the occupied Norway to impede Nazi Germany's development of a nuclear weapon. As the action took place during the Second World War, it clearly action fell within the laws of war. In more recent times, the concept of counter-proliferation has been advanced, comprising a wide spectrum of actions to impede the development of nuclear weapons, including the destruction of nuclear equipment through sabotage and assassination of nuclear scientists. As such actions may be carried out outside the context of war, they may violate international law. In the best-known case, the bombing of the Iraq's research reactor Osirak in 1981, Israel was condemned by the Security Council. And the Israeli bombing in 2007, on the other hand, on an allegedly nuclear installation under construction in Al-Kibar in Syria, that did not result in a similar reaction in the Council. Nor have media, to my knowledge, have media reports about sabotage directed against Iran's nuclear enrichment program provoked any legal discussion. Can states then legally undertake armed intervention and destroy life and equipment in peacetime if they judge that such action will impede a potential adversary's development of a nuclear weapon? The US National Security Strategy of 2002 does not assert that this is the law, but seems to think that it should be the law. The strategy claims that for a very long time, international law has allowed states to defend themselves against forces that present an imminent danger of attack, And it argues that that concept should be adapted to the capabilities of today's adversaries. And I quote, "The greater the threat, the greater is the risk of inaction, and the more compelling the case for taking anticipatory action to defend ourselves, even if uncertainty remains as to the time and place of the enemy's attack. To forestall or prevent such hostile acts by our adversaries, the United States will, if necessary, act preemptively." It says nothing about whether they think they believe that other countries would be entitled to take the same action. The UN Charter that I quoted at the outset of this lecture recognizes the right of self-defense against an armed attack, and many interpreters of the Charter are of the view that this right extends to imminent attacks as well. However, to equate the building of a research reactor that could be of use in a future production of weapons-grade plutonium with an imminent attack would evidently be a stretch. and the US security strategy of 2002 does not do that. Without even mentioning the UN Charter, the strategy simply argues the case for action in some situations that lie beyond the limits currently drawn, even under the liberal interpretation of the UN Charter. Now, where does the Obama administration stand on these questions? Well, the new security strategy, which I think will be made public this week, if it's not already public, has been reported to be more restrained than that of 2002 and less unilateralist. If so, I think it will be welcomed around the world. As there were no nuclear weapons or other weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, the case illustrates the risk of the doctrine allowing preventive armed action against alleged threats. If conclusions about potential adversaries' intentions are wrong because of erroneous intelligence or bad judgment, the doctrine leads to meaningless bloodshed. It is striking that in the lively discussion about Iran, the question of the legality of armed action against Iranian enrichment facilities is hardly ever raised. We can be sure that the Security Council will not authorize such action. It would amount to allowing an armed intervention against alleged and denied intentions. It is improbable that any member of the Security Council would even table a resolution to that effect. Armed action against Iran can also hardly be taken under the UN-recognized right of self-defense. Speeches that Israel should be wiped off the map are condemnable, but amount neither to an actual attack, armed attack, nor an attack that is imminently justifying preemptive action. There is, nevertheless, a risk of preventive action that it might be taken to avoid the somewhat distant risk of an Iranian mushroom cloud. I think it's likely that the dire political and economic consequences will stand in the way of such action. The valid legal objections would be sustained, but they would not constitute the major factor. Before I discuss the non-military avenues in the Iran question, let me note some basic matters relating to the Iran question. An industrial scale capability to enrich uranium allows the production of low-enriched uranium for power reactors, as well as highly enriched uranium for weapons. If you can produce to 3%, you can produce uranium to 93%. Having developed a capability to enrich uranium, a country may not need much time to develop a weapon, if it wants one. Suspicion about Iran's intentions in this regard have raised the political temperature in the Middle East and prompted severe controversies. At the political level, there have long been two diametrically opposed positions. Iran asserts that it is only exercising a right under the NPT to the peaceful use of nuclear energy, including enrichment. And the UN Security Council and the states negotiating with Iran are so far unconvinced that all parts of the nuclear program have only peaceful purposes, and they demand in particular that Iran shall suspend its enrichment program. Now, some facts and circumstances should be kept in mind here. Although Iran has not been accused of diverting nuclear material or violating the NPT, and although not all suspicions and allegations may be well-founded, there is enough to lead a large number of governments, including those of the P5, to urge Iran to suspend the enrichment program. The enrichment program can hardly be prompted by economic interest. Iran has so far only 2 nuclear power reactors with fuel supply guaranteed by Russia. Sweden, my own country, with 10 nuclear power reactors, finds the import of enriched uranium more economic than the indigenous production of indigenous enrichment. And South Korea, with 20 nuclear reactors, also rely upon the import of enriched uranium, finding it less expensive than indigenous production. An Iranian desire for uranium fuel independence would be understandable, but an indigenous enrichment capability would not bring such independence. Iran is reported to have only limited deposits of natural uranium resources and would be obliged to import uranium oxide yellow cake in the long run anyway. Iran often evokes the right under the NPT to enrich uranium as a reason for refusing to discuss suspension. However, the treaty, the NPT, imposes no obligation to enrich. A tolerance, a permission to do it, yes, but an obligation, no. If Iran were to find that on balance suspension of enrichment would be to its advantage, there is certainly no legal objection or bar obstacle to it in striking a deal. Now, it is conceivable that no offers or threats from the outside world would impact on Iran's cost-benefit analysis for the enrichment program. Nevertheless, negotiations often start with opposed adamant positions, and the way to learn whether or not positions and lines are immutable is through negotiations. In my view, President Obama deserves praise for allowing the United States to engage in direct talks with Iran rather than continuing the backseat driving and a rather haughty position that serious negotiations, including the United States, could only come as a reward for Iran giving way on the main point by suspending enrichment. Now, which negotiator gives up a trump card before even sitting down to play? Despite the sensible U.S. move, regrettably, the direct talks have gone nowhere so far, and they have become entwined in the separate completely separate question of the fuel for the Triga reactor. A settlement of that limited issue would ease tension somewhat, but it would in no way provide a solution to the controversy about the continuation of Iran's enrichment program. The compromise does not envisage a termination or suspension of the big program. It talks only about a sort of swapping operation concerning a quantity of low-enriched uranium in return for fuel for the research reactor. What non-military developments are conceivable regarding the enrichment in Iran? An outside observer cannot detect any movement in the deadlocked positions of the negotiating governments on the principal issue of enrichment. The 3+3 powers insist on suspension and must weigh their offers and threats. Iran insists on enrichment, but might be weighing the offers and the threats that are made, such as the suspension of sanctions that are ongoing and may come, more sanctions may come. They must weigh the possible facilitation of financial transactions and investments that they would obtain if they were to reach an agreement. They will weigh the assistance in the development of peaceful nuclear power, which is also held out as a possibility and a quid pro quo in case of a deal. And they will also weigh the promised support for membership in the World Trade Organization if they strike a deal. So these are chips on the table put by the negotiating states. It would not be difficult to add further elements that could be offered to influence the cost-benefit analysis. North Korea, for instance, appears to have been offered diplomatic relations both with the United States and Japan, and been offered guarantees against armed attacks from the outside and subversion in the inside. Now, would such offers be politically more difficult to make in the case of Iran? Other chips on the table could perhaps have regard to oil and gas pipelines and various kinds of political cooperation, for instance, regarding Afghanistan. Now, some observers say that Iran has come too far in the nuclear process to retreat 1 inch, and that the world should accept Iranian enrichment and only insist Iran accepting what is demanded from other NPT states, namely the application of strengthened IAEA safeguards under the additional protocol. The NPT conference here in New York, which is ending this week, seems not to have dealt with ideas like these, but has focused on agreement on some future procedures leading to discussions about this Middle East zone free of weapons, of nuclear weapons. This, of course, was the way in which Iran and Arab states used to urge the elimination of Israeli nuclear weapons. Today, however, the Iranian enrichment program is a new element that much increases the concerns of Arab states. A nuclear weapon-free zone alone does not meet that problem, nor, for that matter, would be a test ban zone meet that problem. The states in the Middle East, I believe, would need to supplement a nuclear weapon-free zone by adding agreement to exclude enrichment and reprocessing in the region, at least for a prolonged period of time. North and South Korea concluded such an arrangement in the 1992 joint denuclearization, so there is some precedent for it. They did so, of course, in order to increase the confidence between the two that neither of them would use such facilities for the development of material for weapons. Although such agreement would oblige Iran to dismantle its enrichment program and Israel to dismantle both weapons and enrichment and reprocessing, it would not be pointed to anyone but ensure all in the region against proliferation and be in line with the current efforts to avoid the spread of fuel cycle activities. Of course, in today's atmosphere, the idea is a somewhat wild card. It would have to be developed inside the region, not least as regards effective system of inspection in such a zone. It is obviously way beyond what Israel would contemplate today. However, if both the peace process and the Iranian program were to move on, perhaps Israel would one day conclude that the arrangement would be better than a Middle East with Iran and later perhaps more states building enrichment plants for plants and maybe weapons. I remember hearing the former U.S. ambassador to the UN, Mr. Bolton, saying that his views on the nuclear weapon states, what nuclear weapon states there might be in the world, didn't differ very much from President Obama. He said President Obama doesn't want to have one nuclear weapon state, not one. Zero. For my part, Bolton said, I want only one. And I think it's similar with Israel has seen its nuclear weapon program as a life insurance. They would like to have one nuclear weapon state in the Middle East. But if the prospect in the future were for more than one, then perhaps they would prefer the zero. For Iran, such an arrangement of a zone free of nuclear weapons and of fuel cycle facilities would have the cost of scrapping an expensive enrichment program that may offer prestige but no economic advantage and no long-term fuel assurance. Iran would get the credit for an elimination of nuclear threats in the Middle East, and the ensuing détente would certainly allow a reduction of military expenditures in the area. Now then, let me make some comments regarding North Korea and terrorist movements. It seems to me that in the last few years, the great powers have cooperated wisely regarding the North Korea, and while exerting economic pressure, have offered all that the DPRK has asked for: economic assistance, diplomatic relations, security assurances, and maybe even a peace treaty. It is hard to conclude that the intermittent backtracking and stonewalling by North Korea could be a way of seeking a better bargain than the one they have been offered. Perhaps it is a result of shifting positions of factions within the leadership in the North Korea, or perhaps hardline military in control want tension and controversy to justify a continued hardship and military rule. These are speculations, admittedly. There are not very many people who have a clear insight into what's going on there. Whatever may be the case, it seems wise for the outside world to avoid being provoked. Seoul being within artillery reach from North Korea, military action is not really an option. The recent torpedoing of a South Korean ship cannot, of course, be left without response. Further economic pressures seem the only option, and may also, together with North Korea's own failed system, help to bring the regime down one day. Terrorist movements generally believed to be unable to build enrichment capability. Enrichment facilities are big and difficult and expensive to do. The likelihood that a terrorist movement would be able to steal and handle the real nuclear weapons is judged to also to be remote. The non-Lugar program has been and remains of great value to put locks on nuclear stocks and to reduce the number of sites where weapons-usable material is handled. It continues. Terrorist movements could perhaps manage to make a so-called dirty bomb containing radioactive material like cobalt or cesium and set them off in some urban area. The recent Washington summit to create awareness at the highest state levels of the need to keep track of such material made much sense. This awareness should also be created in the public, if one can, that dirty bombs can cause radiation damage, but they are no nuclear weapons. They are very far from nuclear weapons. Now let me turn to nuclear disarmament. When in the spring of 2006, the Weapons of Mass Destruction Commission that I headed presented its report on the outlook for disarmament, that the outlook for disarmament was still dismal. The U.S. National Defense Strategy of 2005 had stated in all modesty, I quote, that the end of the Cold War and our capacity to influence global events opened the prospects for a new and peaceful system in the world. That was in 2005. However, by 2006, the Iraq War had discredited this overconfidence in military power. And in January 2007, George Shultz and Henry Kissinger, Bill Perry and Sam Nunn surprised the world with an article in the Wall Street Journal declaring that the Cold War was over in 1990, that deterrence was obsolete between the US and Russia, that the big risk was proliferation by states and rogue states and non-state actors, and that to prevent such proliferation, the US and Russia should initiate a nuclear disarmament process that would lead eventually to the elimination of nuclear weapons. They did not judge it possible to continue with a system where some had nuclear weapons and others would stay without such weapons. The article contained a list of actions needed in the short and medium term and stressed the need to solve regional disputes. Mr. Obama, as you remember, espoused this approach in his presidential campaign, and he and President Medvedev declared in London that they would put the Cold War behind themselves, to pursue nuclear disarmament and even aim at the nuclear weapon-free world. In Prague then, in 1st of April 2009, President Obama presented a long list of nuclear disarmament measures, many identical with measures that had been advocated by the commission I headed and by the group of the Gang of Four. President Obama's program certainly contrasted starkly with the attitudes of the Bush administration. Yet he seems relatively cautious in my view. I mean, he declares that he does not support unilateral disarmament and that he doubts that nuclear disarmament will get to global zero in his own lifetime. Now, he was given the Nobel Prize for his initiatives, and some people were very sarcastic about it and said that he hadn't actually achieved any disarmament, he'd only talked about it. Well, it occurred to me then that Al Gore had also not stopped the global warming, but he had talked about it and he has put it on the agenda. And to put something on the agenda in the world today is a very big thing, and it has remained on the agenda, and this spring certainly has been one in which we have seen quite a number of steps in the field of disarmament. So, in my view, he certainly deserved the Nobel Prize very well. But the big question is now, will the new approach and drive of the Obama administration help to give the world nuclear disarmament? The recent US-Russia START follow-on agreement is a tangible result and creates a springboard for further action. Will it be ratified by a US Senate that does not seem to be ready yet to ratify the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty? We don't know. There's expectations and hope for it, but no certainty. The recently published US Nuclear Posture Review confirms the serious push of the Obama administration to reduce the role of nuclear weapons. For instance, it rejects the construction of any new type of nuclear weapons. Now, which are now the obstacles to nuclear disarmament? Hawks in the US and elsewhere already focus on the end goal of eliminating nuclear weapons and charge that it is naive, as I mentioned the word in the beginning. It is a pity, but perhaps inevitable, that attention is focused on this point, while the challenges today have regard to issues like the entry into force of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty and the negotiation of a cutoff of production of fissile material for weapons. If we ponder the chances of phasing out nuclear weapons, perhaps we should begin by discussing what are today the risks of war. Clearly, after the end of the Cold War, they have been sharply reduced. since the beginning of the 1990s. Wars used to be about borders, about territory, about religion, or ideology, as during the Cold War. Between the big powers, it's hard to see such conflicts any longer. China and India, I trust, will continue to handle their border differences pragmatically. We can expect further civil wars, and there is likely to be armed conflicts in a few regions, in particular in Africa, where borders are often not settled. There are also some flashpoints that touch the interest of big powers, Taiwan and Kashmir and the Middle East. However, they will hardly ignite a world war. And war between the US and Mexico, where you had wars in the past, there won't be any in the future. War in the Latin America, South American region, hardly. Within the European Union, no, not after the creation of the European Union. And between Asian states, hardly. Could competition about oil and gas and other commodities and pipelines trigger war? Well, I wonder, does it not seem more likely that such frictions will play out in prices? Despite this hopeful outlook, many military officials and people dealing with military strategy in the US and elsewhere urge their governments to maintain high military readiness and pay anything between 2 and 4% of the GDP for such readiness. While in the US, the Gang of Four said that deterrence was obsolete between the US and Russia and of diminishing importance in other relations. The recent US nuclear posture review certainly is holding on to the importance of deterrence. This position must be premised on the view that the risk of big armed conflict is still real. Is this view justified? Is war plausible between P5 states? Well, the Gang of Four seems to doubt it, and so do I. And some people may perhaps say that this is a romantic attitude, and I remember a Swedish saying that when the devil gets old, he becomes religious. Well, I think that they have become wiser and matured. They lived through the Cold War as I did, and I think that is the maturity that they have come to, and I'm glad they did. We often hear from the big powers that they do not consider each other as adversaries any longer, but are concerned rather about the terrorists and a few irresponsible governments. Now, if so, why acquire new aircraft carriers, space fighting capabilities? Why allow the world to use $1,400 billion a year on military items, out of which you American citizens are paying 45%? The reason must be that for now, the skeptical voices are prevailing in the United States and elsewhere, and people in the US and elsewhere are buying this cautious attitude. Can we accelerate the movement towards nuclear disarmament? I think so, and I think the recipe is diplomacy and further détente. We need to continue resetting many buttons. Let us be clear that the New START agreement would hardly have been reached had President Obama not moved the missile shield links from Poland and the Czech Republic. We need more of such constructive thinking. And let me give you some examples of that. If, as we are told, the missile shield is not meant to protect the United States against Russia and China, but against reckless governments, why not create it cooperatively between the US, Europe, Russia, and China? And I'm encouraged by recent talks between the NATO organization and Russia. In Europe, nuclear weapons under NATO command appear to be a relic of the Cold War. Why not withdraw them? They have, in my view, long been the low-hanging fruit. It is true that Russia has no veto against the security arrangements of its neighbors, but it's also understandable that détente with Russia will not be promoted if the NATO alliance is moving up military coordination, listening devices, and weapons to the borders. Differences between the big powers cannot be overcome by the creation of new blocs, but must be tackled by conciliation, cooperation, and the development of joint institutions. Fortunately, the accelerating international interdependence will force everybody in this direction, and is already doing so. The UN's United Nations system is a major instrument to be used and to developed rather than being disdained. As my countryman, Dag Hammarskjöld, once said, and I will add one quote to yours, Marie. He said once that the UN system might not take us to heaven, but it might help us to avoid going to hell. Thank you.
Well, Hans Blix has kindly agreed to participate in the questions and answer session. So whoever wants to ask a question on, there have been many very important issues that you have addressed, and so the floor is open. Yes.
Yes. I'm Rhonda Haubin, and I've been covering the UN for.
Yes. If you,
yes,
each of you, when you speak, if you can identify yourself as you do and your organization.
And I've been watching the Security Council and what they've been doing with Iran and North Korea. And I guess I'm very troubled by what you presented about both Iran and North Korea. It seems to me the Non-Proliferation Treaty provides for the inalienable right for peaceful production of nuclear materials and whatever. And it's clear that that is a right of Iran. There has been no proof of Iran doing something of weapons, and it just seemed, and when you presented, you made it seem like there is proof. There is no proof. And somehow the treaty guarantees the right to that inalienable right. It says nothing on the treaty shall be done to take that away. And yet the Security Council is, under the name of the treaty, taking that away. And so one, that I think that's very serious. Two, Iran has a long history of having trouble getting the materials that other countries can get. And that it's had sanctions from the US since '79 in all kinds of ways. And so I just feel you left out that whole history and made the assumption Iran is doing what people who seem to want to prevent the inalienable right are using the treaty. So I'm troubled by that, because this seems a second example of what happened with Iraq is happening with Iran. And then there's North Korea. And North Korea, if people who specialize in North Korea, and many of the books show that the US has gone back on every commitment it's made to North Korea. And that there was so that there's somehow a whole history with North Korea where it is in a very threatened situation. There's a nuclear umbrella against it from both with the US to South Korea and to Japan. And so it just seems to fit more in the category of a nation that feels itself at threat. And so I don't understand your examples of the two of them as as being the problem. And so I just, after you've been through that incredible experience with Iraq, where this was a very, this was real trouble with what was done with Iraq, can we learn something about it? So I don't understand, how we're now back there.
I understand your question. Well, in relation to Iran, perhaps I was not sufficiently clear, but I thought I said that the Security Council, no one else has said that Iran has violated the Non-Proliferation Treaty. I didn't say that. I said that even some of the evidence brought against Iraq might not be well-founded, but there is enough to cause a large number of governments be suspicious that Iran has the intention to go for nuclear weapons. That is the background. I'm not saying that the case has been proved, and I also made it clear that yes, the NPT allows the state to enrich uranium. But the fact that there doesn't seem to be an economic case for enrichment, that it is not a solution, long-term solution for Iran for fuel assurance, because Iran does not, according to investigations, have very much raw uranium in its ground. So then it's natural that the outside world asks itself, why does it do this? And they haven't said they violated, but they offer Iran a number of a deal with a number of chips on the table, and I think some of them are useful, and notably they are not denying Iran going for nuclear power. one could have expected perhaps that would happen, but that's not the case. The outside world and the offers have been to support their peaceful nuclear power program, building nuclear power reactors. It is only concern that a program to build facilities for the enrichment of uranium, which could go up to a weapons grade, which Iran denies they has intention to do. But yeah, I think it's important, very important to note that the outside world is not against a modernization or in Iran's entry into the modern technology. And the Russians, of course, are helping them to build the Bushehr reactors, and that is accepted by the outside world. Now, for Iran, there are those who think that Iran has come so far that they would not, there's no chance that they will back down. That is possible. But there is nothing in the NPT that would prevent them from striking a deal. Iran is sometimes saying that the NPT allows us to enrich uranium, fine, but there's no obligation to do so. If they would like to strike a deal, they could. And I think it's for them to weigh and make the cost-benefit analysis in this, and I hope they do. Now, I don't think that Iran necessarily has gone so far that there's no way back. The world doesn't lack nuclear installations which have been abandoned. So Argentina, for instance, had an enrichment plant up in Pilcaniu. I've seen it myself, and they are not using it. South Africa is not, to my knowledge, using the enrichment plant at the moment, which they could certainly assert that they have a right to do. Brazil does, although it's a part of the NPT. Japan has also enrichment plants, and they certainly have a use for a lot of what they produce. So I don't see any impossibility in it, but it may be that they're determined that this is a question of pride and of prestige, and they could invoke, I think, the fact that they were denied, they had a great difficulty in getting fuel for the Triga reactor quite a number of years ago after the religious revolution. Then they had placed an order for new fuel in the United States for this new US-made reactor, and they paid for it. They got neither the money back nor did they get the fuel, and eventually they were able to buy fuel from Argentina. So this, I think, they could invoke and say that, look, we need to assure fuel ourselves. And I think that when the Western world is discussing now fuel for the Triga reactor, they should also tell themselves that, look, if we simply say they cannot have any fuel for this Triga reactor unless they suspend the whole enrichment program, Iran could respond that, look, there you are. We need to have our own program. Otherwise, we cannot even have fuel for our reactor. But this is a separate issue, and I think it perhaps made a bit too much of it at the present time. The central question remains, after all, the continued enrichment program in Iran. And the way I saw, or the way I sketch a solution, was a somewhat far-reaching and an idea that goes much beyond what is on the table anywhere now, namely that you should have not only a zone free of nuclear weapons, which would oblige Israel to do away with its nuclear weapons, but it also would exclude any enrichment plants and reprocessing plants. And that's precisely what the two Korean states have agreed. Now, this would be the ideal solution, but we are far from that today. And I think for Israel, I think it would be out of question to consider it at the present time. However, if Israel were to see that the evolution were towards more enrichment in the Middle East, then perhaps they would contemplate it. But it's not a solution for today. I thought it is a fairly balanced evaluation. I'm sorry if you had the impression that I was standing on one side here. I can see both the weaknesses of argument from all the sides and the weaknesses in the negotiations that have taken place so far. Now, North Korea, you mentioned, again, of course, the North Korea, what encouraged me about Iran is, first of all, I don't see that there really is a threat to their security any longer. In my assessment, they began exploring the program of enrichment at the time when there was the war between Iraq and Iran. And at the time when the Israelis bombed the Iraq reactor in 1981, they might well have feared that Iraq would go on, and that they, therefore, security reasons began. Today, I do not see that Iran realistically have any big security threat. Certainly not from Pakistan, from Turkey, from Afghanistan, maybe even the U.S. Aircraft carriers in the Gulf. But they know at the same time that this threat from the U.S. and from Israel is only there so long as there is an enrichment program. So, with the absence of a serious threat to Iran, I think there ought to be increase the chances of some agreement. Now, in the case of North Korea, again, I think security considerations originally moved them towards nuclear weapon program. The U.S. commanders in the Korean War in 1950 asked for authorization to use nuclear weapons. I think they got the authorization, but in any case, it was not used, fortunately. So they moved on, and what gives some hope, I think, for a solution there was that after all, in the 90s, for quite a number of years, they stopped the reprocessing plant after a visit by Mr. Carter. And I think that had the psychological effect of such a visit was very important. It was a former U.S. president that came to North Korea, met with Kim Il-sung, and the upgrading, the recognition that he was a country that needed courtesy and correctness at any rate, this, I think, was important. So for a number of years, they stopped the reprocessing, and our inspectors from the IAEA were there to inspect the reprocessing plant. But we have to admit that at some stage during this period, they also began with enrichment. And that did collide, at least with the 1992 denuclearization agreement. So while there was acceptance and implementation of one agreement, nevertheless, there was something that happened in the background, and that was not a straightforward respect of their agreements. So I'm not surprised that there was then a clash. And I don't think this clash was handled very well on the Western side all the time. I'm not saying that. But nevertheless, that's the background. I think that North Korea has a good deal of responsibility for the situation where they are. And I think that at the present time, the outside world is handling it rather well with the wisdom. It's very difficult to see any solution. As I said, I think North Korea has in fact been offered practically everything. I cannot see that they are trying to increase, to get a better deal any longer. They're getting what they're asking for. That's why I'm speculating, why are they doing this? Is this a result of jockeying positions within the North Korean regime? Or is it that it's a military regime in control? Is it due to the fact that they say that we want to have tension, we want around our country, that will justify continued military expenses in our control? These are speculations, but whether this is right or not, in any case, I think that the patience and and not allowing oneself to be provoked is the right one. They have to respond, of course, to torpedoing a ship. It was such a grave thing. There must be a response to it. But nevertheless, I think it's wise and it's an encouragement that you have all the P5 members on the same line here. And of course, they will have to aim in the long run for some sort of security arrangement in the Far East, in that corner of the world.
Yes, over there, and then.
Just very briefly, my name is Jay Hobbin, and I write for the Omai News in South Korea occasionally. But just very briefly, on September 19th, 2005, the six-party talks did arrange for the suspension of all nuclear activities, in the beginning of the process of denuclearization. And on the next day, or the next 2 days, economic sanctions were put against North Korea, sabotaging the very agreement that happened on the 19th. By the 20th or 21st, the Banco Delta Asia in Macau was being attacked economically. So North Korea has a long set of examples when it does come to agreement. It makes its agreements. It had the agreed upon framework all during the 90s, and it's always somehow broken before it gets a chance to break it. So North Korea has to be reluctant, I think, to take the deal, because it's taken it a number of times and it hasn't worked out.
Well, as I said, I'm not suggesting that the negotiation has been ideal all the time on the Western side, certainly not. But there remains the fact that while there was an agreement in 1994, and that was respected as regards reprocessing, there was a movement by North Korea to go to enrichment, and that does certainly not suggest much of a reliance on them. I think that the patience that's now being shown is exemplary. I also don't think that when they talk about dangers to their country, I could see that they would identify the Bush administration as a rather threatening administration, but I find it very hard to believe that they really think that the Obama administration is more threatening than the Bush administration.
First of all, congratulations on the... My name's Alfred Ross. Congratulations on the launching of the Salzman Institute. It's a marvelous addition to Columbia, and you've chosen a superb director who I've known for many years, and a wonderful speaker. On Iran, if it's true, as you suggest, that Iran under NPT has a legal right to enrich, whether or not it's economically feasible, what is the legal basis for the UN Security Council demand that they cease enrichment? And as a matter of international law, can the Security Council, by demanding that they cease what they have a legal right to do, does that automatically become law, that they must cease? In other words, is there any legal basis for the Security Council demand? If there's no legal basis for the demand that they cease enrichment, is there any legal basis for new sanctions?
Well, the Non-Proliferation Treaty gives the right to use nuclear techniques, including enrichment, to develop peaceful nuclear power. But of course, if there is a question whether it is peaceful, then it can be argued that the right disappears. I don't agree with those who claim that it's the forfeiting the rights. That expression has been used. I think that's going too far. But I can see the basis in this statement that we have reasons to believe that this is not peaceful, and we ask you to show with credibility that the program is peaceful. And there are elements in that program and development of the program which have cast doubt upon the intentions. But I agree with you that it began as a suggestion, a demand of Iran to suspend as a confidence-building measure. That was how it began, both with the IEA and I think in the Security Council. And when that didn't help, then it went on, if my recollection, with the use of Chapter 7 and a mandatory decision that they must suspend. One can have one's doubts about that. The fact is, nevertheless, that the Security Council's decisions, demands of this kind, are binding. There is no appeal court to it. You cannot go to the International Court of Justice and say that this is not reasonable. It's the Council that decides. And one would have expected that a member within the Council, if some of the members had doubts about the legal wisdom of going this, that they would object to. But you find here a consonance. You find the 5 permanent members doing it. So I would not advocate or argue that these decisions are not binding. It may be unwise if the Security Council asks for more than it can get, then the respect for the Council may go down. But I would not dare as a lawyer to argue that these are not binding. I think this Council also went further and said that they would be ready to discuss with Iran conditions once Iran has suspended the enrichment program. And that was in line with the position of the US and the other states, that first they must suspend, thereafter we can talk. And I was very curious to see what would happen with Mr. Obama's stand, that he could talk directly, which I welcomed. I thought that was good. And I thought, don't they have somehow to modify the position of the Security Council? Here is an order as that you shall suspend, thereafter we'll talk. But they simply ignored it, as far as I know, and went into direct talks, and I think perhaps just as well. But nevertheless, that was the result, and I think of Obama's sensible policy of getting to direct talks. They may be resumed, but now I think we are in the distraction of the particular program about the trigger reactor fuel. It's made a big thing, and I think if it were to be solved, and I think Turkey and Brazil deserves praise for it. If it succeeds, then I think it will ease tension somewhat. It will show that if all parties are ready to make some concession, you can have some result. If it fails, well, then it will exacerbate the situation even further, make the atmosphere even more bitter.
Yes, the gentleman in the back.
Hey, Adam Peoria. I'm just covering this for the Columbia Record. That was a very sober and non-hysterical talk, and it made me feel better living in New York City about the possibility of nuclear bombs exploding here. But I just wanted to know what keeps you up at night. You know, I mean, you're talking about non-proliferation, but what do you see as the greatest threat, the greatest, you know, if there was going to be some sort of nuclear calamity, where is it most likely to come from? Even taking into account that it's unlikely, what is the most dangerous flashpoint at this point, in your opinion?
Well, I think we are discussing the case where it could be most immediate, and that's North Korea. I mean, they have the nuclear weapons, and they have tested the nuclear weapons. I don't think it's very likely that they would use it against anybody. I think perhaps the greatest fear would have is that they would sell nuclear technology to somebody. But I don't see any sign of that. I don't feel particularly reassured by the Proliferation Security Initiative that will stop ships. I mean, 5 kilograms of plutonium is about the size of my hand, so I don't think you need a big cargo ship to export that anywhere. But it's not without a danger. No, as you say, I mean, I'm more inclined to calm a bit. I don't agree with the idea of cascades. It's not, the world is not without risks in this regard, but it gives very good headlines. Anything alarmist gives very great headlines, and I'm interested in seeing how can we calm down. It's something bizarre about the military expenses of the world being $1,400 billion a year at the present time. And I saw an editorial in the Herald Tribune the other day in which they praised your Secretary of Defense, whom I think is a very sensible, balanced person, that he's holding back the military expenses. They were about 4% addition in real terms increase until he got there. And now he's trying to hold them down to between 2 and 3% in real terms increases. Well, at a time when there is détente in the world, so my answer is how can we make this process faster, to decelerate? And my answer to that is diplomacy. I think that if you have more calm, then it is easier also to say that we don't need all this readiness. You don't need to have more aircraft carriers to meet the danger of non-state actors. You don't need to have a tremendous amount of space fighting capability for Al-Qaeda. So the military strategists, I think, are saying that, yes, there is still a risk of war between P5. Perhaps not with Russia. They say it's receding. But nevertheless, how long are we going to pay these levels? And I think that the levels can go down if we have more diplomacy and more resetting of the buttons. And I think that although Obama administration says that the movement of the missile links from Poland, Czech Republic were justified and motivated by other things than a détente with Russia, nevertheless that was an effect. I mean, I was been to Moscow recently, and I see how much they resented these things. It was not that they felt threatened that the U.S. would be able to attack Russia and Russia would not be able to attack back. No, but they resented this sort of intrusion on their doorstep. They thought that was not very elegant, to put it euphemistically. And similarly, when you go to Russia, you find the idea of expansion of NATO into Ukraine and Georgia was also something they say, okay, they decide their own security relations, we have no veto in this regard, but don't expect that détente will increase by it. After all, when the Cold War ended, the Warsaw Pact was dissolved. And what happened? Well, a number of the Warsaw Pact members immediately went over to the NATO Pact. And I can understand them. They had been occupied by the Soviet Union in reality, so I can understand them. But it was not anything that was designed to further the détente between Russia and the Western world. Now, after the Georgian affair, I don't think in the Western states there is any wish to have at least Georgia as a member of NATO, because Saakashvili, in my view and many others' view, acted somewhat recklessly. And to have a reckless leader in a NATO state, perhaps attracting Russian attacks, would not be a very good thing, because they would be obliged collectively to intervene. So going away from that, I think, is good. I don't think that Obama administration has declared that that's the purpose, but it's clear that the European states are not going to be more in favor of adding Ukraine and Georgia. If you look at the election campaign, there I think Obama was in favor or supported the idea of expansion of NATO with Ukraine. And I don't think, as you heard, dissented from it. But if you look at what Mr. McCain said, I mean, he was advocating the idea of a League of Democratic States. And all states, including these former Soviet states, they could be members, if they were democratic and willing, they could be members of it. And that, to me, sounded like setting up a sort of alternative to the UN, an organization of friends which could perhaps legitimize a use of force, which they would not get through the Security Council because there's a veto in the Security Council. Well, the idea collapsed, and I think it rightly should collapse. But to Russia, it must have seemed that the US wanted to move towards a new policy of containment, which saved the Western world. I take off my hat to what NATO and the containment policy achieved. But I think after the end of the Cold War, I don't think it's the right policy. And it seems to me that the US and the West now are ready to lower the tensions by discussing with Russia the security architecture in Europe. Only a few days ago, Mr. Biden, your vice president, wrote a very long, a very detailed article about the further reconciliation and détente between US and the Western Europe on the one hand and Russia on the other. I think it was very constructive. He did not accept the idea that there would be a new security organization. God knows that there are enough security structures about Europe already, but he pointed rather to the idea that the Organization for Security Cooperation in Europe, which is located in Vienna, that more life would be blown into it, and was a willingness to discuss security between Russia and the United States. And these two states, after all, are the ones who have, by far, the largest number of nuclear weapons in the world, so they are very important. But you cannot also ignore the Chinese, because they are growing very fast. I was in Shanghai and Beijing only 10 days ago, and you see the tremendous vigor with which they are moving ahead. Fortunately, so far with rather controlled nationalism. It's not without some risk in nationalism, but I think it requires pragmatic attitudes and conciliant attitudes to bring this world to more cooperation, more use of multilateral institutions than we had, certainly we had during the Bush administration.
Yes, gentleman on the fifth row.
Hi, I'm Gerald Stang. I'm a recent graduate here. Quick question about Iran and I guess Israel. You spoke about how it's essential for non-proliferation efforts to address the security questions of individual states. And for Iran, I was hoping to get your idea of their perceptions of Israel and how central that is to their calculus as opposed to other things in the area. And connecting a little bit the political and legal sides of the calculus, how Israel could be incentivized to potentially change its approach to the legal status of its weapons, and whether if Israel would change how it approaches nuclear issues, whether that could have an impact back towards Iran.
Well, that's my speculation. I don't see any sign of it at all today. And Netanyahu government is fairly hawkish on the issue, but I don't think Israel is a democratic state, and there are many different views in that country. There are also different views about what they should do elsewhere. And the simple calculation I have is that if Iran's program moves on, and I'm not saying I want that, but if it moves on, and if at the same time there is some opening towards a peace process in Israel, then it would seem to me that there would be a possibility of discussing for Israel to do away with the nuclear weapons, and at the same time the Iran and others committing themselves to having no fuel cycle activities. I mean, there's a general drive, a wish in the world to have fewer fuel cycle activities, because each of these facilities make it physically possible, at any rate, if not politically possible, to produce nuclear weapon material. So it is in line with that general drive, but there is no opening to it at the moment. The Israelis themselves presumably look upon their nuclear weapons as a life insurance, but let me remind you that when the program was originally launched, there was no enthusiasm about it in the Western world, nor in the United States. It had gradually been sort of acquiescence that it is there, but no enthusiasm about this, and Israel is not a naked without nuclear weapons. They are formidably armed with conventional weapons. So it's not that they would stand there exposed to being being attacked by the others. However, I'm suggesting that you need a security arrangement for it. It may be that such a zone will require security guarantees from the outside. It certainly will require guarantees about the access and availability for nuclear fuel for the reactors, but also security guarantees. And I think Israel already has more than an alliance with the United States, so they feel secure. But if they would wanted to, maybe there could also be security guarantees to multilateral kind from the Security Council. And why not contemplate having Israel as a member of NATO? If Albania can be a member of NATO in Eastern Mediterranean, why not Israel? If that could help. But my point is simply that, yes, you have to supplement such arrangement with also security guarantees.
Yes.
On Pakistan, do you think that considering India has signed onto a non-first strike policy that...
Could you identify yourself?
Oh yeah, I'm Stephen Bronstein. I'm a student at Franklin and Marshall College. So considering India has signed onto a non-first strike policy, do you think Pakistan overassesses its perceived threat against India, both nuclearly and militarily over Kashmir? And do you think that detracts from their counter-terrorism capabilities?
Well, I'm not very hopeful about any arrangement between India and Pakistan unless they move forward on the Kashmir issue. In the political realities, I think they push in both in good and bad directions. And I'm not an expert on that question, but what I hear from many people is that it seems that both sides know fairly well what should be the solution. It's sort of like the Israeli question, Palestinians. People know what should be the solution, but they can't get there. And the same thing with the Kashmir issue, that they know where to go. And I think the U.S. can play a good role, and probably does play a good role there, because the U.S. has established a strategic relation with India, and at the same time is very dependent upon its relations with Pakistan. So I think it's probably one case where the U.S. is helpful.
I have a question related to that. There was, when you mentioned how successful the NPT has been, and there are very few nuclear powers that emerge after the NPT. India and Pakistan are two outside the NPT. There was recently, it was initiated by the Bush administration, but confirmed by the Obama administration, a nuclear deal between the United States and India. How do you see the impact of that deal on the non-proliferation policy?
I think it was very negative. I mean, I don't think that it was a violation of the NPT, because the NPT says that the exchange of technology and the transfer of technology should be facilitated between parties to the NPT, but it does not prohibit the transfer of technology to non-members of the NPT. So there was not a violation of this, unless one can point and show that this facilitates for India to proliferate, to make more nuclear weapons. And there are allegations that this can happen because I did mention that India has relatively little uranium of its own. And if they are able to import fuel, well, then they can also use their own indigenous uranium to enrich it to a higher level, to weapons grade. So on that basis, it could be argued that the deal with India actually was a violation of the U.S. obligation to refrain from proliferation by helping India. I have another greater concern about that agreement, and that is I don't think it all was motivated just by the Bush administration by wish to achieve nuclear cooperation. I think that the intention was, and it was stated by political leaders, the intention was to improve, to create a strategic liaison between the United States and India, in an effort to build some kind of a chain around China with India, Australia, Japan, South Korea. That was often stated, and I have the same reservations about that as I have about building a new containment policy vis-à-vis Russia. I think, fortunately, I haven't seen any very negative comments from the Chinese side. They have been very restrained. and it may. I don't think necessarily that the Indians will allow themselves to be involved in a chain against China. They probably want to retain their freedom. Nor do I know whether Australia would like to do so. But I think the intent was certainly on the side of the Bush administration to create such a new containment policy. And that, in my view, is not a policy for this millennium. I think the policy for this millennium is to bring them all in to a multilateral cooperation in international institutions. So I have rather serious reservations about it, though I don't. And it also undermined the non-proliferation policy in the sense that it certainly went against the agreements under the Nuclear Suppliers Group, because the Nuclear Suppliers Group is the agreement between the nuclear suppliers that they will not export any nuclear material or technology to countries that don't have full-scope safeguards. And that's to say, full-scope safeguards is what you have when you are a party to the NPT, and India evidently didn't have that. So they had to ask for an exception in the the US had to ask for an exception in the Nuclear Suppliers Group. And there were a number of states who were opposed, who asked questions: New Zealand, Austria, Denmark, Sweden. But the pressure of the big United States was so great that they all gave way. And in China too, who had perhaps reasons to worry about this, they also didn't object. Maybe they felt that if the US can do that to India, then we can do it to Pakistan. That's a possibility that this was the calculation. But it was certainly a deviation from the joint determination of the Nuclear Suppliers Group not to facilitate any further build-up of nuclear weapons. So I think it was reprehensible and unwise from many points of view, but it seems to be fairly popular in the US Congress. Even among Democrats, I do not see any great criticism of it.
Yes.
Thank you. Larry Johnson, I'm teaching at Columbia Law School as your legal advisor. You mentioned certainly attracting a lot of attention, and some of that, of course, has been the risk that Al-Qaeda or some terrorist groups get their hands on a nuclear weapon. And I'm thinking of that in terms of Pakistan as well, in terms of what you do when you have a nuclear power whose government may be weak or shaky. You have that in North Korea to some extent, but in Pakistan you have the crossroads of terrorism, Pakistan Taliban, extremist groups, perhaps radical military. What is the safety? Are there any plans or anything you can think of to make sure that either their nuclear facilities are under control and not subject to being raided or being sold to Al-Qaeda?
I think it's a very troubling question that you raise. Sometimes we read in the papers that Pentagon certainly has a plan B somewhere, whatever it is. But I don't think that's very easy at all. What I would think is that the tradition, after all, is in Pakistan that the military, in the last resort, have a very good control. And that is what the US military seems to say, that we are confident that in Pakistan, the military in command, that they also have control of the weapons and the stores. And I hope that's justified. But I think it's troublesome, especially if you say if you were to have a radicalization element among the military, it's not without very unpleasant risks you can paint. And I think the North Korea is probably a different element. That's less danger, but in Pakistan we can see the groups fighting with each other. Well, again, in the longer term, I think it is the Kashmir issue. It's between India and Pakistan. I don't think that India would go for disarmament except to do it in tandem with the other nuclear weapon states. It's not going to happen before that. But so long as they have Kashmir as a festering issue, it's going to be very, very difficult. And for the immediate future, the next time, no, I don't see any safe solution to the problem.
Yes.
My name is Paul Teitelbaum. I'm a Columbia student. Does the Non-Proliferation adequate measures for inspections to guarantee that peaceful use is being adhered to? Is Iran cooperating with inspections? And if they are not, or if any nation is not, does that void their right to enrich uranium?
Well, I thank you for the question, because I touched on verification very lightly in my introduction. Perhaps you would expect me, having been the head of the IAEA for 16 years and in charge of the Iraq inspections, I should touch upon it more. Well, the inspection was something that became necessary when the world decided that the way to counter nuclear weapons was to avoid any possession of them. When you only had a ban on chemical weapons, the ban was against use, it was not against possession. But the moment you say that we commit ourselves not to possess it, well, then you have to ensure also that this that there is credibility in this even in peacetime. And the only way to do that was to have inspectors. However, the world has not been used to having inspectors milling around in important industrial installations. And therefore there was a lot of resistance to go very far. Originally the NPT had its edge perhaps more against Germany, against Japan, against industrialized countries like Sweden and Austria, who might be tempted to go for nuclear weapons. And the risk of cheating or hiding something in these countries was very small. So the demand for very intrusive inspections and far-reaching rights of inspectors, these demands were not very strong. And we got a system then accepted, which allowed for checking that there was no diversion from declared facilities, but there was no right for inspectors to go to non-declared facilities. Nor would they have known where they should go, because we have no intelligence apparatus who would go around and going into big countries and searching at random was not meaningful. So it was a limited system, and it was only when our inspectors went into Tarmiya in Iraq in 1991 and saw the calatrons that they called them Baghdadtrons, but they were American calatrons from California. Then we went to the board of the IAEA and said that, look, our system has failed to discover this. They were working on this during the 80s, and our system was not strong enough to discover it, because we only went to declared installations. This was never declared. So we need another system under which the inspectors can also demand to go elsewhere than the declared installations. And we would also say we would like to turn to intelligence and say, if you have suspicions, tell us, because we have the right to go anywhere, would have the right to go anywhere under the new system. Well, we undertook a number of changes that we could do without asking for approval of member governments. It was lay in our existing capability, but to get much further, we needed also to draw up a protocol under which governments would give the IAEA much further rights. We started that in 1993, and it wasn't ready until I left the IAEA in 1997, when it was adopted by consensus by our General Conference, and I was very happy with that result. And it is a considerable strengthening of the safeguard system of the ability of inspectors. And also the techniques of inspection and verification have improved very much thanks to US assistance, where they have worked very much in Sandia and other places. For instance, take the example of environmental sampling, as it's called. Now, the nuclear, you can't smell the radiation and the nuclear activities, but instruments can pick them up very, very easily. It leaves fingerprints tremendously. And you might remember that in the beginning of the Iraqi crisis, the Iraqis took hostages. They took also a number of American hostages and placed them in Tuwaitha, which was their nuclear center. And then the hostages were released at one point. And when the American hostages came out, they gave their clothes to their secret services, and they analyzed the clothes. And they were tiny particles. They say, aha, they are dealing with enrichment. So you need very tiny things to discover. And this technique has then been refined and developed. You can take samples of water or biota or even air, and you can detect, aha, they are doing something here. So the techniques have gone far beyond the satellites. The satellites, of course, remain very important. but the techniques of environmental sampling is very great. So the whole system is more sensitive then to discover, but I would not say that it's 100%. And we as inspectors in the Iraq affair, we got a lot of praise and said, people come to me and said that, well, you were right, you told them there were no weapons. We did not say so. We said we have carried out 700 inspections in 500 different sites. We have been to some 3 dozens of sites given to us by intelligence, and nowhere did we find any weapons of mass destruction. And we were ready to go on and continue with this. But the point is that it's very hard to prove the negative. And if we were to come to say that on balance we don't think there's a thing, then the Bush administration, British too, probably would have come and say, have you looked here? Have you looked there? How can you say this? This is not responsible. So that's not what the inspectors do, and they cannot do it. And you should be absolutely sure there's not a little mouse somewhere here in this room proving the negative. It's pretty hard. So that will remain in the future. I don't think that you can come to 100% assurance. There will always be a little residue of uncertainty. Now, it doesn't mean that inspection is meaningless. On the contrary, the more you do, the more professional you do, the less the residuary of uncertainty. But that last step is a political decision. Say, yes, there's a residuary. We judge the situation. Can we live with this residuary? And the world did that as regards South Africa. We did very extensive investigations in South Africa. And they suggested that South Africans had dismantled everything. We didn't say there is nothing, but we said this is what we've done. And the world had such a confidence, said, okay, we will act upon this. We will accept, we swallow that residuary. And I think that's how it will be in the future as well, that there will be a residuary. But it still calls for all the possible and reasonable system of inspection. Though you have to guard yourself against one risk, and that is false alarms. If you have a system of inspection and verification that is too sensitive, you may have false alarms coming off, and that is can also be very, very troublesome in international relations. So it's not a simple problem. I'm glad you raised it, and I think that the world has come a long way, and I don't think it will stand in the way of disarmament. You see, often we hear said that, how can you guarantee that not somebody will not have some bombs left in some cave somewhere in the world in the future? Well, the systems in 20, 30 years from now will be even better, and now countries will be more open also to inspection. Yet, the world will be different in 20, 30 years' time from it is now. As I said, a world free of nuclear weapons will not be the world of today minus nuclear weapons. We will have security systems that have moved much forward, will be much more dependent upon each other, and therefore I think that the conclusion that we can live with the residuary will be less difficult than many people presume now.
Maybe one last question. Lady.
I'm Mickey Kaufman, undergraduate with the School of General Studies here at Columbia. You've been talking a lot, and we've been asking a lot of questions about compelling the behavior of North Korea, of Iran, and other countries seen to be in violation to whatever extent of this nuclear non-proliferation. I'd like to ask you essentially a question that you asked in your own book, which is, how can we make sure that the unilateral actions of the United States in the Iraq invasion have not created a riskier situation, in essence compelling Iran and North Korea to hurry up their nuclear programs in an attempt to outwit counter-proliferation? What sanctions or steps or evolution in American behavior in foreign policy are required to stabilize the situation?
Well, essentially I agree with the European doctrine which I read to you, that you have to, countries in most cases go for nuclear weapons for perceived security reasons. Not invariably. I'm not sure about Gaddafi or about Saddam Hussein in this regard, but in most cases it's a perceived security. And therefore you have to cater for their security. And I think that raising the voice or threatening is not very helpful. Inducement, yes. I mean, if you have economic sanctions may be inducement, but if they go too far, then maybe have the counter effect. And I think the discussion about economic sanctions against Iran is very telling. I mean, the public often say, and perhaps more so in Europe than in the US than Europe, they say that, well, if they don't do it as I say, we'll punish them. But I think that is often more likely that you get results if you offer rewards and if you offer security. And the North Koreans have been offered security. I agree with the comments we had here about Macau. It may be that the measures they took there on the financial side had some inducement, but it was also a risky one. It could also have been provoking the North Koreans. One has to be very careful in the calibration of this. The public does not. The public say, no, they are not doing as we say, so we have to punish them straight away. But I think that the foreign ministers will know that no, this may not be so. You've had a big discussion as to whether one should stop oil, the delivery of gasoline to Iran, for instance. And that would be a fairly big thing. But many have said that it will hit the general public, and it may well be that it will support the administration, that Ahmadinejad will achieve a rallying around his regime rather than anything else. So it's not as simple as simply knocking somebody out. You have to be sophisticated about it, and on the whole, creating a feeling of perceived security. Yes, that is fundamental, and I think they're trying to do that with North Korea. They are offered this, and therefore it's a bit puzzling that they do not succeed, and that's why I'm speculating at what may be the reason. I don't think anyone else is coming up with any other solution for North Korea. As regards Iran, of course, there is prestige in this, and this is, yes, this is perhaps the final last word that I offer, and that is that I think that humiliation among states is a very, very bad thing. And if you are big and strong and expect to be respected, then humiliating and saying, you say uncle first. This is perhaps very natural, but very unproductive. And it will remind many of these states about the colonialist time when they were told to behave themselves and treating them. Well, even the word behave has been used. I remember Condoleezza Rice used the word, say they should behave themselves. Well, that's the way you talk to colonies and to children. But to do it, whatever you think about the government you are talking to, you better use a correct line.
Okay, well, I just want to thank you again. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Hans Blix, for inaugurating this series. Thank you very much.